The silence of the third-floor stacks was a physical weight. It pressed down on Leo's shoulders, settled in his lungs, and made the frantic thumping of his own heart sound like a war drum in the cavernous quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, buzzing pallor on the rows of books that stood like silent, judging soldiers. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint, acidic tang of despair. Or maybe that was just him. He stared at the page, at the elegant, cruel dance of symbols and numbers that made up the Advanced Differential Equations textbook. They swam before his eyes, a meaningless soup of Greek letters and esoteric functions. An hour ago they had been a challenge. Now they were an indictment, a testament to his failure. His fingers, cold and numb, traced the worn leather cord of the bracelet on his right wrist. It was a simple, braided thing, a gift from his mother from a time when her hands were steady enough to make such things. Now her hands trembled, and the cost of keeping them from trembling more was a figure so vast it felt like a fiction, a number as abstract as the ones on the page in front of him. He was drowning. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way of crashing waves and flailing limbs, but in the slow, quiet, inexorable way of a man sinking into thick mud. The scholarship demanded a 3.8 grade point average. His was currently a 3.2, teetering on the edge of a cliff. And this class was the final, decisive push. A cough echoed from the end of the aisle. Soft, unobtrusive. Leo flinched, pulling his hand back from his face as if he'd been caught in a crime. He was supposed to be studying, not wallowing. He forced his eyes back to the problem, to the elegant curve of an integral sign that felt like a sneer. He had been here for 6 hours. The dregs of his coffee were cold and bitter in the paper cup beside him. The library would close in 2 hours, and he was no closer to understanding the material for tomorrow's midterm than he had been at noon. Every failed attempt to solve a problem was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of his academic career. Another sound. The quiet, rhythmic squeak of a cart's wheel. He didn't look up. It was probably a librarian preparing for the nightly ritual of reshelving. He hunched lower over his book, trying to will the information into his brain through sheer proximity. The cart stopped. Leo's breath hitched. He could feel a presence nearby, a stillness that was different from the ambient quiet of the library. It was a focused, human silence. He kept his head down, his world shrinking to the stark white of the page and the black of the ink. "Are you finding everything you need?" The voice was low and calm, a smooth baritone that cut through the humming anxiety in Leo's head without shattering the silence. It was impossibly gentle. Leo looked up, startled. The man standing beside the cart was not a librarian. He was tall, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers that looked comfortable but impeccably tailored. His hair was a dark brown, touched with silver at the temples, and his face was all quiet lines and intelligent angles. But it was his eyes that held Leo captive. They were a warm, clear hazel, and they were looking at him not with pity, but with a kind of serene, analytical concern. He wore an ID badge that read Julian Croft, Academic Support Center. A tutor. Leo's throat felt tight. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. To be seen like this, so obviously floundering, so pathetically lost. He looked like a child who had wandered into the deep end of the pool. "I'm fine," Leo managed, the words sounding rough and unconvincing even to his own ears. He gestured vaguely at the book. "Just working through a few things." Julian's gaze flickered down to the textbook, then to the notebook beside it, filled with furiously scribbled equations, each one crossed out with a violence that spoke of pure frustration. He didn't comment on the mess. He simply nodded, a small, thoughtful movement. "That's Professor Albright's advanced course, isn't it?" Julian asked. His voice remained soft, conversational. He has a particular fondness for Laplace transforms. Leo just stared. He couldn't form a response. The fact that this stranger could identify the course, the professor, and the specific, God-forsaken topic from a single glance felt like a magic trick. A trick that only highlighted his own incompetence. The trick, Julian continued, leaning a hand against the bookshelf, his posture relaxed, non-threatening, is to remember that the initial conditions are your anchor. Most students get lost in the algebra and forget what the transform is actually trying to accomplish. He pointed a long, steady finger at a line in Leo's notebook. You're trying to solve for both constants at once. Find your value for y0 first. It simplifies the entire second half of the equation. Leo looked from the man's finger to the equation. He followed the logic, his tired brain slowly clicking into gear. The variable he'd been carrying through 6 lines of frantic calculation, the one that kept creating impossible fractions. It could have been solved and substituted on the very first step. It was so simple, so obvious, and he had missed it for hours. A sound escaped his lips, a pathetic little puff of air that was half laugh, half sob. He dropped his head into his hands, the rough paper of his palms scraping against his forehead. The dam of his composure, already cracked and leaking, finally broke. He didn't cry loudly, but his shoulders began to shake with the silent, racking effort of holding it all in. The failure, the fear, his mother's face in his mind's eye, her hopeful smile when he'd first gotten his acceptance letter. All of it pressed down, and he finally buckled. He expected the man to leave, to walk away, embarrassed or annoyed by the display of emotion. It's what anyone would do. He waited for the squeak of the cart's wheel, the quiet footfalls retreating down the aisle. Instead, he felt a warmth near his elbow. Julian hadn't moved. He had pulled a book from a nearby shelf and was calmly examining its spine, giving Leo the illusion of privacy while remaining steadfastly present. He wasn't staring. He wasn't judging. He was simply there. After a long moment, when Leo's shaking had subsided into a series of exhausted tremors, Julian spoke again, his voice still that same impossible, gentle pitch. "My shift ended 10 minutes ago," he said, sliding the book back into its place with a soft thud. "But I have some time. Why don't we move to one of the study rooms? The lighting is better." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a gentle command that offered a lifeline. Leo lifted his head. His eyes felt raw, his face hot with shame. He looked at this stranger, this calm, quiet man who was offering help when all Leo had shown him was weakness. "I can't pay you," Leo whispered, the admission costing him what little pride he had left. Julian met his gaze, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, softening the sharp angles into something deeply kind. "Consider it a professional courtesy," Julian said, from one mathematician to another. He nudged the textbook with his finger. "Let's start with problem 3. I think you'll find it's easier than it looks." For the first time in months, Leo felt a flicker of something other than dread. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation. It felt like hope. The study room was a small glass-walled cube, a pocket of focused silence within the larger quiet of the library. The lighting was, as Julian had promised, better. It was a warmer, softer yellow that didn't buzz and flicker, and it made the space feel less like an interrogation room and more like a sanctuary. Julian set his worn leather satchel on the table with a soft thump and began to unpack its contents with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. A slim laptop, a notepad, and a series of perfectly sharpened pencils. Leo sat opposite him, feeling clumsy and out of place. He slid his own battered textbook and chaotic notebook across the table, the items looking shabby and desperate next to Julian's organized calm. He kept his hands clasped in his lap, twisting the leather bracelet around and around his wrist. Julian didn't start with the math. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, and simply looked at Leo. Not in a probing way, but with that same quiet, observant stillness he'd had in the aisle. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leo," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Julian," the man offered in return, as if they were two people meeting for coffee and not a drowning student and his unexpected rescuer. "It's good to meet you, Leo." Something about the simple formality of it, the way Julian said his name, settled a small part of the storm inside him. He felt seen, not as a collection of problems and failures, but as a person. "Now," Julian said, leaning forward and pulling Leo's notebook closer. He turned it so it faced him, his brow furrowing slightly as he studied the frantic scrawls. "Tell me what you think the problem is asking for, not in mathematical terms, in plain English." Leo hesitated. Professor Albright had always talked in theorems and proofs, a language of pure, cold logic. No one had ever asked him to explain it in his own words. "It's about predicting how a system changes over time," Leo began, stumbling over the words. "Like the temperature of a cup of coffee cooling down, or the decay of a radioactive element." "Exactly," Julian said. And the simple word of validation was like a balm on a burn. "It's a story. Every equation tells a story. The variables are your characters, and the operators are the actions they take. You're just the narrator, figuring out how it all ends." He picked up one of his pencils. The lead was sharp, precise. He didn't cross out Leo's work. Instead, he began to annotate it, drawing small, neat boxes around certain terms, connecting others with clean, straight lines. He wasn't erasing Leo's mistakes. He was building a map out of them. "You have all the right pieces here," Julian explained, his voice a low, steady murmur. "You're just putting them together in the wrong order. You're trying to build the roof before you've laid the foundation." For the next hour they worked. Julian's method was a revelation. He never gave Leo the answer. He would ask questions, leading him down a path of logic until Leo discovered the answer for himself. With every small breakthrough, every "oh" of understanding that escaped Leo's lips, a knot of tension in his chest loosened. The numbers on the page began to stop swimming and started to align, to make sense. They began to tell their story. He learned that Julian had a doctorate in theoretical physics, but preferred teaching. He learned that the man spoke about mathematics with a quiet passion that was infectious, transforming the dry, intimidating subject into a landscape of elegant patterns. As the library's closing announcement echoed faintly over the intercom, they finished the last problem on the review sheet. Leo stared at the solution in his own handwriting, a clean, logical progression from problem to answer. He had done it. He understood it. A feeling of profound, bone-deep relief washed over him. It was so potent, it left him feeling lightheaded. He looked up at Julian, who was watching him with that same gentle, knowing smile. "Thank you," Leo said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. I don't know how to thank you." "You just did," Julian replied, gesturing to the notebook. "Understanding is the only payment a teacher ever needs." He began to pack his satchel, his movements once again efficient and calm. "We should do this again. I have a session open on Wednesday afternoon, if that works for you." Leo's heart sank. Wednesday. He had to be honest. "I told you, I can't afford the university's tutoring rates." "I'm not talking about the university's rates," Julian said, shouldering his bag. He pulled a small card from his wallet and slid it across the table. It was plain, with just his name, a phone number, and an email address. "I also do some private work. We can figure something out that works for you. A sliding scale." Leo picked up the card. The card stock was thick, substantial. It felt like a promise. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Julian said. "I have a good feeling about you, Leo. You have a good mind. You're just carrying a heavy load." The observation was so direct, so accurate, that it stole the air from Leo's lungs. Julian saw it. He saw past the math, past the panic, and saw the weight. And he wasn't running from it. He was offering to help lighten it. As they walked out of the study room and towards the library's grand, echoing exit, a small figure came hurtling towards them from a bench near the entrance. "Daddy!" A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, with Julian's dark hair and wide, curious eyes, launched herself at his legs. Julian's entire demeanor shifted. The calm, scholarly man melted away, replaced by a father. He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed in the quiet space, and scooped her up into his arms. "Hey, Firefly," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Was Mrs. Gable good to you?" "She let me draw a unicorn with a sparkly horn," the girl announced. Then her eyes, bright and inquisitive, landed on Leo. "Who's that?" "Lily, this is Leo," Julian said, his voice soft with affection. "Leo, this is my daughter, Lily." "Hello, Lily," Leo said, a small, shy smile touching his own lips. Lily considered him with the grave seriousness of a child. She looked at his tired eyes, his slightly disheveled hair, and then her gaze fixed on the leather bracelet on his wrist. "I like your bracelet," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. She reached out a small hand and gently touched the worn leather. "It's like a secret snake." Leo chuckled, a real, unforced sound. "My mom made it for me." "Is he your friend, Daddy?" Lily asked, turning her bright gaze back to Julian. Julian looked at Leo over the top of his daughter's head. His eyes were warm, and for a moment, Leo saw a flicker of something he couldn't name. It was something deeper than kindness, something more personal than professional concern. "Yes, Lily," Julian said, his voice quiet but certain. "I think he is." The simple, innocent validation from the child and the quiet, firm agreement from the father struck a chord deep inside Leo. Standing there in the hushed, cavernous lobby of the library, bathed in the soft glow of the exit sign, he felt the fragile architecture of his life shift. A new support beam had just been lowered into place. He wasn't just a failing student anymore. He was Leo. And he was Julian's friend. The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm, a quiet cadence set by his sessions with Julian. They met twice a week, sometimes in the library, but more often at a small, quiet coffee shop a few blocks from campus. The bitter scent of coffee and the low murmur of conversations became the backdrop to their work. Julian refused any payment beyond the occasional cup of coffee, which Leo insisted on buying, a small token of his immense gratitude. The math began to feel less like an enemy and more like a puzzle. Julian had an uncanny ability to reframe every problem, to find the one simple analogy that would make a complex concept click into place for Leo. The midterm came and went. Leo walked out of the lecture hall not with the familiar cold dread of failure, but with a quiet, tentative confidence. He had known the answers. He had understood the questions. But their sessions drifted. They would start with differential equations, and by the end of the hour find themselves talking about everything and nothing. Leo learned that Julian's wife, Anna, had been a botanist, and that Lily had inherited her mother's love for strange and wonderful plants. He learned that Julian had once dreamed of being an astronomer, of charting distant galaxies, but had found a more profound sense of discovery in teaching, in seeing the universe click into place in a student's eyes. In return, Leo found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He talked about his mother, not just her illness, but her fierce spirit, her love for painting, the way she could make a small, cramped apartment feel like a palace. He spoke of the pressure he felt, the desperate need to succeed not for himself, but for her. to give her a life where she wouldn't have to worry about the next medical bill. Julian never offered platitudes. He never said, "I'm sure it will all be okay." He just listened. He would nod, his hazel eyes full of a deep, empathetic understanding, and when Leo was done talking, he would gently steer the conversation back to the math. It was his way of helping, of giving Leo one small corner of his life that he could control, one set of problems that had a clear, definitive solution. One afternoon, a text came through on Leo's phone. It was an alert from his bank. His account balance was dangerously low, a stark, brutal number that made his breath catch in his throat. His part-time job at the campus bookstore wasn't enough. The check he'd sent home for his mother's prescription copays had cleared, leaving him with almost nothing for the rest of the month. He must have made a sound, a small, sharp intake of breath, because Julian looked up from the equation they were working on. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Leo said, shoving his phone back into his pocket. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. "Just spam." Julian didn't press, but his gaze lingered on Leo for a moment too long, his expression one of quiet concern. For the rest of the session, a new layer of tension settled over Leo. The numbers on the page began to swim again, each one mocking him, reminding him of the other more terrifying numbers in his bank account and on his mother's medical bills. That evening, the pressure became unbearable. An email arrived from the university housing department, a final notice regarding his overdue dorm fees. They were threatening to lock him out of his room if the balance wasn't paid within 72 hours. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He had nowhere to go. He had no one to ask for help. He thought of calling his mother, but the idea died before it could fully form. The last thing she needed was his problems heaped on top of her own. He had one friend, Mia, but she was struggling just as much as he was, working 2 jobs to make her own ends meet. His fingers, acting of their own accord, pulled up his contacts. His thumb hovered over Julian's name. It was a crazy idea, inappropriate. Julian was his tutor, not his savior. To burden him with this was a violation of the unspoken boundary between them. But the memory of Julian's kind eyes, of his calm, steady presence, was a powerful lure. He remembered what Julian had said. "You're just carrying a heavy load." He didn't call. He couldn't. But the thought of it, the simple possibility of reaching out, was a tiny pinprick of light in a vast and suffocating darkness. The next day he showed up for their session looking, he was sure, like a ghost. He hadn't slept. His skin felt tight over his bones, and there was a tremor in his hands he couldn't control. They were in the library again, tucked away in their usual study room. Julian took one look at him and set aside the textbook. "Leo," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Talk to me." "It's nothing," Leo lied, his voice cracking. "I just pulled an all-nighter." "I've pulled my share of all-nighters," Julian replied, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't that." He waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of the library and the frantic beating of Leo's heart. It was the same technique he used when they were stuck on a difficult problem. He would wait patiently for Leo to work through it himself, and just like with the math, it worked. The silence became too much to bear, the weight of his secrets too heavy to hold alone. "They're going to kick me out of my dorm," Leo whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and fear. "I'm behind on the fees. I got a final notice yesterday. I have 2 days." Julian didn't react with shock or pity. He simply absorbed the information, his expression calm and thoughtful. He processed it like he would any other variable in a complex equation. "Okay," he said finally, the single word a strange comfort. "Okay. What's the amount?" Leo told him. The number felt obscene. impossibly large. Julian nodded slowly. He tapped a finger on the table, his mind clearly working. The university has an emergency student fund. It's not well publicized, but it exists for situations exactly like this. The application process is a nightmare, but I know the administrator who oversees it. I can make a call. Leo stared at him, dumbfounded. You would do that? Of course, Julian said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. But that won't solve the immediate problem. The application will take at least a week to process. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. My house has a guest room. It's small, and it's mostly filled with Lily's art projects, but the bed is comfortable. You can stay there, for as long as you need. The offer hung in the air between them, stunning in its generosity. It was too much. Far too much. Julian, I can't, Leo stammered, shaking his head. I can't impose on you and Lily like that. It's not an imposition, Leo, Julian said, his voice laced with a gentle insistence. It's an invitation. The house is quiet after Lily goes to bed. You could study. And, he added, a faint smile touching his lips, I make a surprisingly good pot of coffee. This was the forced proximity he had read about in novels, a trope that felt absurd and unbelievable in real life. Yet here it was, being offered not as a romantic contrivance, but as a simple, practical solution to a desperate problem. To move into his tutor's home. The idea was terrifying, and in a way he was ashamed to admit, incredibly appealing. The thought of a safe, quiet place to land, even for a few days, was a siren song. Think about it, Julian said, sensing his hesitation. He pushed the textbook back to the center of the table. For now, let's focus on this, one problem at a time. But Leo couldn't focus on the math. His mind was a whirlwind. The guest room, Lily's art projects, the smell of coffee in a quiet house. It was a vision of a life so far removed from his own frantic, desperate scramble for survival that it felt like a dream. A dangerous, beautiful dream. The door to Julian's house opened into warmth. It wasn't just the temperature, a welcome respite from the crisp autumn evening, but a pervasive sense of lived-in comfort. The air smelled of cinnamon and something savory, like roasted chicken. A colorful jumble of Lily's shoes was kicked off by the door, and a crayon drawing of a lopsided rainbow was taped to the wall. It was a home. Leo stood on the welcome mat, his worn duffel bag feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He felt like an intruder, a foreign element introduced into this carefully balanced domestic equation. Come in, don't hover, Julian said, his voice amused. He took the bag from Leo's hand and set it down as if it weighed nothing. The guest room is this way. The room was exactly as Julian had described it. Small, neat, with a simple bed and a desk. But it was also filled with Lily's exuberant presence. Stacks of drawings were piled on the dresser. A half-finished clay sculpture of a blob-like creature sat on the nightstand, and a string of colorful, star-shaped fairy lights was draped over the headboard. It was charming. Lily decided it needed more sparkle for our guest, Julian explained, a fond smile playing on his lips. I hope you don't mind. It's perfect, Leo said, and he meant it. It was the kindest, most welcoming space he had been in for years. That first night was a blur of quiet domesticity that felt both strange and deeply comforting. Lily, upon discovering Leo was staying, appointed herself his official tour guide. She showed him her room, a vibrant explosion of pink and purple, and solemnly introduced him to her collection of stuffed animals. She made him promise to read her a bedtime story, a task Leo accepted with a lump in his throat. Later, after Lily was asleep, he and Julian sat at the large wooden kitchen table, their textbooks open under the warm glow of a pendant lamp. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft scratch of their pencils on paper. The intense, focused atmosphere of their library sessions was replaced by a comfortable, shared quiet. Julian was right. He did make an excellent pot of coffee. Leo worked with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. The crushing, immediate fear of homelessness had been lifted, and in its absence, his mind felt sharp and clear. He could see the patterns in the equations, the stories they were trying to tell. As the days bled into a week, a new routine formed. Leo would attend his classes, then head back to Julian's house instead of the cold, impersonal dorm he no longer had access to. He helped with dinner, his limited cooking skills a source of gentle humor for Julian. He became an expert at untangling Lily's hair and an esteemed critic of her latest artistic creations. He was slowly, imperceptibly, being woven into the fabric of their lives. He saw a side of Julian he never could have in the library. He saw him as a father, patient and endlessly loving, his calm demeanor melting into playful silliness when Lily demanded a monster chase around the living room. He saw him as a man, tired at the end of a long day, rubbing his temples as he read through a stack of papers, a quiet vulnerability in the slump of his shoulders. One evening, Leo was in the kitchen, washing dishes while Julian helped Lily with her homework at the table. It was a simple, domestic scene, the kind of ordinary moment he had forgotten could exist. The warm water, the scent of soap, the low murmur of Julian's voice explaining addition to a pouting Lily. It all conspired to create a profound sense of peace. He looked over at them. Julian was leaning in close to Lily, his dark head bent next to hers, pointing at the worksheet with a long, elegant finger. Lily, her brow furrowed in concentration, was chewing on the end of her pencil. They were a complete unit, a small, perfect world of their own. And he was in it. A feeling, sharp and unexpected, pierced through him. It wasn't gratitude, though he was immensely grateful. It wasn't just comfort, though he felt safer than he had in years. It was something more. A deep, resonant ache of affection for the man at the table, for the quiet strength and unexpected gentleness that had become his anchor. He loved him. The realization was so sudden, so absolute that he dropped the plate he was washing. It clattered into the sink, the sound loud in the quiet room. Julian looked up, his expression concerned. "Leo, you okay?" "Fine," Leo choked out, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Slipped." He turned back to the sink, his hands shaking. He felt like a fraud. He was living in this man's house, accepting his help, all while harboring a secret, impossible feeling. Julian had been kind to him, professionally and then personally. He had offered him shelter. He had not, in any way, offered him his heart. The escalating conflict was no longer about his grades or his finances. Those problems, while still present, were now manageable, thanks to Julian's guidance. The new conflict was entirely internal, a war being waged in the quiet spaces of his own mind. How could he continue to live here, to look Julian in the eye, knowing what he now knew about the state of his own treacherous heart? The proximity that had once been a comfort now felt like a torment. Every casual brush of their hands as they reached for the same book, every shared smile over one of Lily's ridiculous jokes, every quiet evening spent in shared silence, it all became charged with a new, dangerous meaning. He started to pull away. He stayed later at the campus library, manufacturing excuses about group projects. He took on extra shifts at the bookstore, even though he didn't need the money as desperately now that his housing was secure. He needed distance. He needed to breathe air that wasn't saturated with Julian's quiet, steady presence. Julian, of course, noticed. He was too observant not to. "You seem distant," he said one night, finding Leo in the living room long after midnight, staring at a blank television screen. "Just tired," Leo mumbled, not looking at him. "Long week." Julian didn't buy it. He sat down in the armchair opposite the sofa, the space between them feeling like a chasm. "Did I do something to make you uncomfortable, Leo?" If this arrangement isn't working— No, Leo said, the word coming out too loud, too fast. No, it's not you. It's perfect. You've saved me, Julian. It's me. I'm the problem. You're not a problem, Julian said, his voice soft but firm. You're a person, and something is wrong. I want to help. You can't, Leo whispered, the words raw with a pain Julian couldn't possibly understand. You can't help with this. He stood up, needing to escape the intensity of Julian's gaze. He had to get out, to put some space between them before he did something stupid, like confess everything and shatter the fragile peace of this house. He fled to the guest room, his heart a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. Leaving Julian alone in the dim light of the living room, the quiet question of his concern hanging unanswered in the air. The sanctuary had become a cage. The storm broke on a Tuesday. It wasn't a metaphorical storm, but a literal one. A furious autumn squall that lashed rain against the windows and rattled the old house to its foundations. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside Leo. He had received the official letter that afternoon. The university's emergency fund had approved his application. His dorm fees were covered. He was no longer in crisis. He had no more excuses to stay. The thought of leaving, of returning to a life without the quiet rhythm of this house, without Lily's bright laughter and Julian's steady presence, was a physical pain. He was packing his duffel bag, his movements slow and leaden, when Julian appeared in the doorway. He wasn't saying anything, just watching, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. The funding came through, Leo said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from the t-shirt he was folding with meticulous, unnecessary care. I can move back to the dorm tomorrow. Thank you for everything. I'll pay you back for the food and— Stop, Julian said. The word was quiet, but it had the force of a physical blow. Leo stopped, his hands frozen on the shirt. Is that what you think this was about? A debt to be repaid? No, of course not, Leo stammered. You've been avoiding me for a week, Julian continued, stepping into the room. The space suddenly felt very small. You've been a ghost in this house. I thought I was helping you, but it seems I've just made things worse. If you want to leave, Leo, then leave. But don't insult me by pretending this is about money. The unfairness of it, the sheer, tragic irony, was too much. Julian thought he wanted to leave. He thought Leo was ungrateful. The injustice of it cracked open the careful walls Leo had built around his heart. You think I want to leave? Leo's voice was a choked whisper. He finally looked up, and he knew his eyes were full of the misery that was consuming him. Julian, being here, it's the first time I've felt safe in years. It's the first time I've felt anything other than scared. Then why are you running? Julian asked, his voice softer now, laced with genuine confusion. Because I don't belong here. The words tore out of him, raw and ragged. I'm a charity case. I'm your student, your project, and I've ruined it. I've ruined everything by feeling things I shouldn't feel. A clap of thunder rattled the house, punctuating his confession. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into a deep, disorienting darkness, lit only by the occasional stark flash of lightning from outside. In the sudden intimacy of the dark, with the storm raging around them, the last of Leo's control crumbled. I'm in love with you, he whispered into the blackness. The words felt like a surrender, a final, desperate admission of a truth he could no longer fight. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable rejection, the awkward, pitying silence. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He could hear Julian's breathing, slow and steady. He could hear the rain drumming against the glass. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Julian was moving closer. Leo braced himself. He felt a warm hand cup his cheek. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the storm. Julian's thumb stroked softly over his skin. "Leo." Julian's voice was a low murmur right beside his ear. "Do you have any idea how difficult it has been for me to watch you pack that bag?" Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Leo saw Julian's face. It was inches from his own, and the expression in his eyes was not pity or shock or disgust. It was a mirror of the same aching, desperate affection that was tearing Leo apart. "My wife, Anna," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "When she died, this house, it lost its heart. It was just a place where Lily and I slept. It was quiet. It was empty. And then you came. You filled the silence, Leo. You brought a warmth back into these rooms that I thought was gone forever." He paused, his breath warm against Leo's skin. "I told myself it was my responsibility as a teacher. I told myself I was just helping a promising student. I told myself I was just being a good person." Another flash of lightning. Julian's eyes were shining. "I was lying to myself," he confessed. Every single day. The space between them vanished. Julian's lips met his, and it was not a kiss of passion or frantic need, but one of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was slow and gentle and certain. It tasted of coffee and rain, and a loneliness so deep it had been forgotten until this very moment of its release. It was the feeling of coming home. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small, dark room, the world had gone perfectly, breathtakingly still. The weight Leo had been carrying for so long, the crushing burden of his fears and his secrets, finally lifted. He was no longer drowning. He was being held. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, clean shadows across the floor. The world outside was washed clean, glistening and new. Inside the quiet of the house, it felt like the first day of a different life. They sat at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them. The awkwardness Leo had feared was absent, replaced by a shy, tentative warmth. They talked, not about the kiss, not at first, but about everything that had led to it. Julian spoke of his profound loneliness after Anna's death, the way he had walled himself off, focusing all his energy on Lily and his work, convinced that part of his life was simply over. "I saw in you a reflection of my own isolation," he admitted, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup. "This brilliant, capable young man trying to carry the weight of the world by himself. I wanted to help with the math, but very quickly it became about more than that. I just wanted to help you carry the load." Leo, in turn, spoke of his own walls, the ones built not by grief, but by fear and poverty. He talked about the shame of needing help, the deep-seated belief that he had to be entirely self-sufficient to be worthy. "You didn't just help me with my classes," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady. "You showed me it was okay to need someone, to lean on someone." He finally met Julian's eyes. "I don't want to be your project anymore, Julian. And I don't want to be your charity case." "I have never, for one moment, seen you as either of those things," Julian said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He reached across the table and covered Leo's hand with his own. His touch was warm, solid, grounding. "What do you want, Leo?" It was a sober, daylight question. There was no storm, no darkness, no high emotion to hide behind. Just a simple, direct query about the future. "I want to stay," Leo said, the answer clear and simple in his own heart. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to be here, with you and Lily. If you'll have me." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Julian's face, a smile that reached all the way to his kind, hazel eyes. "I was rather hoping you'd say that." Their first act as a conscious couple was practical, not romantic. Julian sat down with Leo and all his paperwork, the university bills, the scholarship requirements, his mother's medical statements. He didn't take over. Instead, he helped Leo build a plan. Together they drafted a budget. Julian, using his faculty connections, found Leo a paid research assistant position in the math department, a job that would not only pay better than the bookstore, but would also look incredible on his resume. They mapped out a payment plan for the remaining debt, breaking the terrifying monolithic figure down into small, manageable pieces. He was not saving Leo. He was giving him the tools to save himself. It was the most profound act of love Leo had ever experienced. The threat that had been hanging over him for so long, the threat of failure, of financial ruin, was neutralized. Not by a magic wand, but by a plan, by partnership, by the simple, revolutionary act of not having to face it alone anymore. That evening, when Lily came home from school, she found them both in the kitchen, making dinner together. She stopped in the doorway, her head tilted, observing them with her usual solemn curiosity. Leo was chopping vegetables, and Julian was stirring a pot on the stove. They were standing close, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a comfortable, easy intimacy flowing between them. "Are you two having a sleepover?" Lily asked, her voice ringing with the innocent, direct logic of a child. Julian laughed, a rich, happy sound. He crouched down to her level. "Something like that, Firefly," he said. "Leo's going to be staying with us for a while longer. A long while." Lily's face broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin. She didn't ask why. She didn't need an explanation about adult emotions or complicated living arrangements. She simply accepted it. She ran forward and threw her arms not just around Julian, but around Leo too. A small, fierce hug that encompassed them both. "Good," she declared, her voice muffled against Leo's shirt. "Now we can finish building my pillow fort." Leo looked over her head at Julian, a question in his eyes. Julian just smiled, a look of such profound contentment on his face that it made Leo's heart ache. He nodded. The external conflict was resolved. The internal turmoil was settled. In the warm, cinnamon-scented kitchen of this small, unassuming house, a new kind of family was being built, one piece at a time. It was an equation they were finally solving together. 6 months later, the late spring sun was warm on Leo's face, a gentle benediction. The air was thick with the sweet scent of cut grass and the murmur of 1,000 happy conversations. He stood on the university's main lawn, a sea of black caps and gowns around him, the heavy fabric of his own robe feeling not like a burden, but like a well-earned suit of armor. He had done it. Graduated. With honors. The piece of paper rolled up in his hand, tied with a neat crimson ribbon, felt impossibly heavy, impossibly light. It wasn't just a degree. It was a testament to his survival, a symbol of a future he had almost lost. He scanned the crowd, his heart thumping with a familiar, happy rhythm. And then he saw them. Julian stood near the old oak tree at the edge of the lawn, a quiet island of calm in the swirling chaos of families and graduates. He was wearing a soft blue shirt that made his eyes look even warmer, and he was holding a bouquet of sunflowers, their bright, cheerful faces turned towards the sun. Beside him, Lily was bouncing on her toes, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail, a wide, excited grin on her face. She was holding a hand-drawn sign. On it, in wobbly, multicolored letters, were the words, "Go Leo." As soon as Lily spotted him, she let out a squeal of delight and came barreling towards him, her sign held aloft like a battle standard. "You did it! You wore the funny hat!" she yelled, launching herself into his arms. Leo laughed, swinging her around. He felt a surge of love for this fierce, funny little girl, so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of him. He was no longer just her father's friend or a temporary house guest. He was part of her world. He was family. He set her down and walked towards Julian, his steps sure and steady. Julian's smile was quiet, but it held a world of pride and affection. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. "For you," Julian said, handing in the sunflowers. Their heads were heavy, their petals a vibrant, unapologetic yellow. They seemed appropriate. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice thick. He looked from the flowers to Julian's face. This man, this calm, steady, brilliant man who had walked into the third-floor stacks of a library and pieced his life back together, right alongside the equations. Their new normal had settled into a beautiful, comfortable rhythm. Leo had moved his few belongings from the dorm into the guest room, but slowly his things had begun to migrate. His books appeared on Julian's shelves. His favorite mug sat next to Julian's in the kitchen cabinet. His jacket was a permanent fixture on the hook by the door. They were in the slow, wonderful process of turning Julian's house into their home. Leo had started his new job as a research assistant, and he loved it. He was thriving, surrounded by people who spoke the same language of numbers and theories. He was finally in his element, his mind challenged and engaged. He was no longer just surviving, he was building a life. "I remember sitting in the library," Leo said, his voice low, just for Julian. "I was so sure that my life was over, that I had failed at everything." "You were just stuck on a difficult problem," Julian replied, his hand finding Leo's, their fingers lacing together naturally, perfectly. "You had all the right pieces. You just needed someone to help you see the solution." Lily, growing impatient with the quiet adult talk, tugged on Leo's gown. "Are we going for ice cream now? Daddy promised. 2 scoops." Julian chuckled. "The boss has spoken. We better not keep her waiting." As they began to walk across the lawn, away from the crowds and towards the promise of a celebratory, ice cream-filled afternoon, Julian paused. He turned to Leo, his expression suddenly serious, though his eyes were still smiling. "You know," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "for a long time, I was just pretending. Pretending I was fine on my own. Pretending I didn't need anyone." Leo's heart swelled. He squeezed Julian's hand. "Me too," he admitted. "I was pretending I was strong enough to do it all alone." Julian lifted their joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to Leo's knuckles. "We don't have to pretend anymore." And there, in the middle of the sun-drenched lawn, surrounded by the joyful noise of 1,000 futures just beginning, Julian leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a desperate, stormy kiss like their first one, but a kiss of quiet certainty, of public acknowledgement, of a promise sealed in the bright, hopeful light of day. It was a kiss that said, "This is real." It was the final, elegant proof to an equation they had solved together. It was their happily ever after.